Ladies and gentlemen, my presentation is headed Digital Technology, Why Kantian Reflections on the Difference between Instrumental Rationality and Practical Reason Matter. The talk has 5 parts. After a brief glance in part 1 at some post-humanistic fantasies which accompany the rise of AI, like excessive claims about the upcoming superintelligence of self-directed computers and the apocalyptic inversions, part 2 focuses on post-analytic and hermeneutic analysis of the merits and the limits of digital rationality. Evidently, machine-instantiated algorithms prove useful in many regards. They execute a subsegment of Kant's complex conception of praxis, imperatives of skill, or instrumental rationality in Horkheimer and Adorno's terms. This subsegment is not praxis in its entirety, however. Part 3 presents Nida Rümelin's and Nicole Weidenfeld's idea of a digital humanism, which is inspired, though only in some regards, by Kant's conception of practical reason, and views algorithms as ensembles of tools that are in need of socio-political control. Part 4 argues that the leading ethical ideas of a digital humanism can be further solidified in recourse to Barbara Herrmann's Kant-based analysis of the praxis of moral judgment, as well as to Alan Wood's reflections on humanity as end in itself. Part 5, the coda of the presentation, asserts that the manifold misreadings of autonomy and authenticity in our digital age can be discussed, as Becker-Seubert recently wrote, in a Horkheimer and Adorno-inspired critical theory that rearticulates in contemporary contexts core motifs of Kant's conception of practical reason. Part 1, Introduction. Beyond post-humanistic fantasies and apocalyptic prognosis, a sober philosophical glance at artificial intelligence. For a careful analysis of the reality, as well as the real potentials of digital technologies, neither today's post-humanism-inspired utopian journalism nor its dystopian counterpart are of much help. Post-humanists exaggerate the possibilities of artificial intelligence by fantasizing upon the upcoming superintelligence of self-directed computers that will lead to their singularity. They thus reenact an actually quite old-fashioned, mainstream analytical dogmatic scientism that shuns away from all careful philosophical analysis of the complex, socially structured, non-deterministic action horizons in which AI innovations are embedded. The negative inversion of these post-humanistic superintelligence utopias are spelled out in equally excessive dystopian tales that predict the advent of an unavoidable apocalyptic development of AI. Both fantasies have their basis in an abstract generalization of instrumental rationality, in a distorted image of praxis, which overemphasizes means-end causalisms, that is, in an image that can be criticized, as will be shown in the following, in recourse to Kant's complex conception of practical reason. A sober assessment of the merits as well as the structural limits of AI-based technologies has, other than the utopian and the dystopian AI narratives, first to reflect on the indubitable benefits of digitalization, on the gains, that is, in speed, as well on the exponential increasing reach and the adaptation potentials of algorithm-steered programs, which in many regards quite stunningly outperform pre-AI human technologies. After this, it has secondly, however, to carefully focus on the need for an efficient socio-political regulation of these new digital tools. The Austrian professor of machine learning, Sepp Hochreiter, supported this sober glance at AI recently in his interview "The Algorithm Can Learn Anything, Good Things as Well as Bad Things," in the following words: "I am not afraid that we'll move in the direction of a Terminator or Matrix scenario," Hochreiter said. "I am much more worried that AI technologies will be abused by major corporations, governments or criminal organizations to manipulate the population, steer them in a particular direction, without us ever knowing or noticing." End quote. In Hochreiter's considerations, the technological core of algorithm-directed AI programs, that is the instrumental means and rationality which organizes AI-directed performances and autocorrections, is seen as what it actually is, not as the culmination point of reason, where algorithms lead us in a kind of self-improving learning loop toward a post-human superintelligence, but as a mere subspecies of ratio, as purposive rationality in Max Weber's and Horkheimer Adorno's sense, that is to say in the terminology of Kant, as automated mechanical instantiations of hypothetical imperatives of skill. These instantiations of hypothetical imperatives, since they are exclusively focused on means and relations, systematically, as Kant points out, bracket the core ethical question whether the ends that they implement are good or evil. In a goal orientation that follows the logic of an imperative of skill, Kant famously in his groundwork of the metaphysic of moral rights, there is absolutely no question about the goodness of the end, but only about what must be done to attain it, end quote Kant. The logic of these processes is focused exclusively on the causal connection between means and end, and sidelines the core moral question, which concerns the goodness or evilness of the desired end. Kant's famous example for this limited character of instrumental rationality reads as follows, I quote, "A prescription required by a doctor in order to cure his man completely, and one required by a poisoner in order to make sure of killing him, are of equal value so far as each serves to effect its purpose perfectly," end quote Kant. The purposive rational subsegment of human ratio, our expandable and improvable technical knowledge about the necessary means to reach old or new goals that we desire, remains not only in its everyday mode, but also in its algorithmically programmed machine-instantiated forms at all times, at least inexplicitly embedded in a complex, richly textured and ethically charged environment of practical reason. Not only do all technical technologies ultimately have their origin in human practical explorations, our use of these technologies invites at any time a moral assessment of the results which they produce. AI-directed technologies are no self-runners. In view of the ongoing global career of digitalization, we are today, as Birgit Recki points out in the book Welche Technik, which she edited in 2020, faced with the urgent question, which technology is the right technology? If a sober and non-reductive evaluation of the benefits as well as the losses that are produced by today's global digitalization processes is seriously on the agenda, the human capacity for practical reason has to be philosophically explored. Our ability, that is, to reflect on the moral as well as legal justifiability of the programs that algorithms automatically, but certainly nowhere in Kant's well-defined sense, autonomously execute. Part 2. Do computers literally have cognitive states? Critical reflections on strong AI, Part 1. Searle's distinction between weak and strong AI, and some post-analytic and hermeneutic explorations of the difference between digital rationality and human praxis in the writings of Hilary Putnam and of Dreyfus and Taylor. In his essay Minds, Brains and Programs, the American philosopher John Searle suggests that we are well advised to distinguish between strong and weak interpretations of artificial intelligence. According to strong AI, Searle writes, appropriately programmed computers literally have cognitive states. Strong AI must be false, Searle shows, however. What computers produce are simulations and not at all the entirety they simulate. Quote, Searle, no one supposes that a computer simulation of a rainstorm will leave us all drenched. Why on earth would anyone suppose that a computer simulation of understanding actually understood anything? End quote, Searle. Searle thus opts for a cautious version of artificial intelligence, for weak AI. The principal value of algorithms is therefore that they are very powerful tools which allow us to stimulate aspects of human intelligence, but not, as strong AI falsely claims, human intelligence altogether. Along this line of Searle's critique of strong AI, some of those qualities of human practical reason that cannot be sufficiently reenacted by computer programs were pointed out during the last decades by post-analytic philosophers like Hilary Putnam and by hermeneutics-inspired thinkers like Hubert Dreyfus and Charles Taylor. In his essay from 1992, The Project of Artificial Intelligence, the Harvard logician Putnam early on took issue with theories that reduce cognition either to computations or to brain processes. All attempts to universalize the causal explanation mode of physics and thus to interpret human thought as an automated algorithmic process, attempts which are a central characteristic of today's false, that is strong misreading of AI, are tied in a structurally deep mode to the assumption that the exact sciences offer us the long-sought description of the true and ultimate furniture of the universe. In his text from 1992, Putnam takes issue with this central positivism-informed assumption of strong AI, the assumption that the mind is a sort of reckoning machine. This idea, Putnam points out, goes back to the birth of the scientific worldview in the 17th and 18th centuries, back to Hobbes, who claimed that thinking is a manipulation of science according to rules, analogous to calculating rules, as well as to La Mettrie's materialist conception of man in l'homme machine. Today, hardly well thought out, however, Putnam remarks, the notion of a Turing machine is seen as a way of making this materialist idea precise. But artificial intelligence is actually a misnomer, Putnam writes. AI does not really try to simulate intelligence at all. Its real activity is just writing clever programs for a variety of tasks. AI, Searle would say, is soberly assessed not strong but weak AI. To write such digital programs, Putnam continues, is for sure an important and useful activity, although it doesn't sound as exciting as simulating human intelligence or producing artificial intelligence. The digitally instantiated ratio that AI programs execute is not at all practical reason in its full sense, since in it, to speak with Kant, neither the realm of human thought nor that of human praxis and its horizon of hope can be fully reproduced. Strong AI is a scientific fantasy, which, as Putnam writes, gets today massive support from a tendency in our culture, which for a while was shared also by young Putnam himself, to falsely assume that the best metaphysics is physics. That such a reductionism is seriously flawed can be shown, however, in recourse first, as Putnam shows, to the language game conception of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, and secondly, via a post-analytic rereading of elements of Kant's conception of Vernunft. Late Wittgenstein convincingly pointed out that human sign use is embedded in a plurality of language games that constitute a shared world. All algorithmic processes are thus, insofar as they are interpretable, that is meaningful for us, ultimately and unavoidably situated in our complex everyday world. This shared world is the latent background that already is presupposed in our receptions of algorithm-mediated processes, even in the simulation and partial alteration, that is, of reality experiences in virtual reality, in flight simulation, for instance, or in video games, which are started and stopped by non-virtual real human agents who play them, or in our real reality reception mode of VR glorifying films like The Matrix. For a careful exploration of these preconditions, in which all digital processes are embedded, an in-depth philosophical reflection on human praxis and sign use is needed. A reflection that is, as Putnam insists, that firstly is well advised to learn from the multifaceted action-related language concept of late Wittgenstein, and secondly from central thoughts developed by Kant. Reflections on the conditions of possibility of AI, Putnam writes, have a close relation to what Kant called a transcendental investigation. End quote, Putnam. In a similar vein, exaggerated misreadings of AI were criticized by the Californian philosopher Hubert Dreyfus and his Canadian colleague Charles Taylor. In their joint book Retrieving Realism, published in 2015, the two philosophers take issue with today's attempts to generalize an instrumentalist interpretation of praxis. Dreyfus and Taylor developed their critical arguments, not however like Putnam, in a partially Kant-inspired reinterpretation of late Wittgenstein's conception of language use, but in recourse to core phenomenological thoughts that concern our human existence in a mode of in der Welt sein, being in the world. Dreyfus and Taylor defend against the claims that are raised by strong interpretations of AI, a pluralist, robust realism, which questions the vogue in recent decades for accounts of thinking based on the idea that the brain operates in some respects like a computer. In such accounts, Dreyfus and Taylor argued, complex intuitions that humans have as embodied social and cultural agents are routinely excluded, like for instance that we are able to know in an ongoing social interaction whether my communication partner is mad at me, or that we can realize that the atmosphere of the party has suddenly become tense, etc. Human understanding has an extremely rich texture, and it is thus, as these examples show, not at all limited to those of its segments that digital rationality is able to simulate. The full shape of human linguistic capacities, which Taylor starts to carefully explore in his book The Language Animal, encompasses many modes of reasoning that cannot be algorithmically reenacted. Everyday moral reflections, as well as genuine artistic creativity, religious interpretations of human existence, as well as philosophical attempts to systematically explicate human praxis and thought. Meritorious as Putnam's and Dreyfus Taylor's post-analytic and hermeneutic critiques of core components of today's strong AI rhetoric are, they are just a first step in the right direction. They prepare the ground for a reopening of a non-reductive discourse on the structure of practical reason. A discourse which defends the thesis that algorithms instantiate a subspecies of ratio only, that they execute programmed skills which ultimately are not at all self-sufficient but always need to be evaluated by human practical reason. Part 3. Critical Reflections on Strong AI Part 2. Digital Humanism. AI is nowhere able to fully regulate itself. Quite to the contrary, it's in dire need of socio-political control. The increasing awareness of the downside of legally uncontrolled AI was expressed in 2017 by Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, in his famous statement, "The system is failing." Berners-Lee's dismay provoked many reactions. It called inter alia to the scene the idea of a digital humanism. Julian Niederrömele, Nicole Weidenfeld, Digitaler Humanismus 2018, or Vienna Manifesto on Digital Humanism 2019. A sober reading of AI, which focuses on the need to shape technologies in accordance with human values. Its core idea, to strive in the private as well as the public use of artificial intelligence for enlightenment and humanism, is based on elements of Kant's conception of practical reason. It is the central thesis of the following segments of my talk that Kant's philosophy can be extremely helpful in the attempt to continue and expand Putnam's and Dreyfus Taylor's post-analytic and hermeneutical critiques of AI by looking for a full, it has morality-focused understanding via instrumental rationality. The key medium of technological innovation is not the culmination point of Vernunft, but a mere subspecies of ratio. Algorithms, or in Kantian terms technologically instantiated imperatives of skill, do neither invent themselves, nor start themselves, nor set themselves their goals reflectively. To put it simply, algorithm-simulated intelligence is other-directed, heteronomous. It is not at all the product of a self with an independent will. Its so-called autonomy is nothing but a sensor-steered performance automatism which remains severely limited even if AI programs in so-called machine learning are able to probabilistically readapt to new data. As a technical system, AI is a human product that, like all human products, does implement ideas formulated by its author. It therefore is not at all able to fully instantiate its inventor's capacity for the development of other further inventions. According to this fact, it's most likely that computers will never be able to fully simulate human intelligence. AI is best understood as an ever-increasing ensemble of possibly useful digital tools. These tools need, however, to be carefully controlled in order not to hurt those who are affected by them. AI caused damage can either occur involuntarily as the result of AI steer programs used by employment agencies, for instance, that evaluate by non-transparent criteria the future integration potential of their unemployed customers in the labor market, or voluntarily, as is most repulsively the case in automated assaults performed by AI-steered war drones. Digitalization did start as a big promise, as the promise to globally enhance free communication. The rollout of this innovation soon made clear, however, that these hopes were exaggerated. In AI-driven social media, one-sided, effectively tuned-up communication bubbles that insistently reaffirm narrowly closed worldviews started to more and more destroy the open consensus-oriented discourse, which is essential for any flourishing public debate. Undesirable byproducts of the digital revolution like this led Berners-Lee to his famous warning that the digitalization process is threatened by failure. In 2017, he saw his early expectations that digitalization would produce an open platform that allows anyone to share information, access opportunities, and collaborate across geographical boundaries, challenged on several fronts. Not only, as he writes, was the internet used for the spread of misinformation and propaganda, and people's attention held by very finely trained AIs that figure out how to distract them, the net was more and more used by increasingly powerful digital gatekeepers whose algorithms were weaponized by master manipulators. Berners-Lee's awareness that the system is failing significantly influences the recent debate on digital transformation and ethics. The most promising of today's post-naive takes on AI is the idea of a digital humanism. In 2018, the German philosopher Julian Niederrümelin, in his book Digitaler Humanismus, that he co-published with Nathalie Weidenfeld, criticized strong AI. The Silicon Valley ideology, he pointed out that a humanism which is able to integrate AI is the only plausible retort to strong AI and its uncritical affirmation of a mechanistic misreading of human intelligence. Quote Niederrümelin, the only plausible contrast program to strong AI and its implicit mechanistic thinking is a digital humanism, a humanism which does neither doubt nor endanger human authorship, but expands it by means of digital techniques. In strict opposition to the new mechanistic reductionisms that today in AI discourse are further nourished by the uncritical boom of neuroscience, Niederrümelin and Weidenfeld insist, often in almost Kantian terms, on the difference between algorithms and human actions. AI systems do neither perceive, nor do they have emotions, nor are they able to decide, even if some of them are designed in a manner which more or less simulates human behavior. The Silicon Valley ideologies, however, use in an extremely careless manner metaphors in connection with the purported abilities of AI. In opposition to the feuilleton of vain fantasies of the AI lobby, digital humanists want to promote the real potentials as well as to analyze the real dangers of AI in a sober manner. Digital humanism does not dream of a totally new form of human existence like the transhumanist. It remains skeptical vis-à-vis utopian expectations, but is optimistic in regard to the human ability to positively shape the potentials of digital. This program was seen by many as quite convincing. In April 2019, a first international workshop, Digital Humanism, was organized by the Faculty of Computer Science at Vienna's University of Technology. In the Vienna Manifesto, which was published on this occasion, the following ideas were formulated. The term digital humanism is intentionally chosen to refer to the concepts of humanism and enlightenment, according to which the human is responsible for his or her thinking and is at the focus. See Niederrümelin and Weidenfeld 2:18. We understand this term as an approach which describes, analyzes, and more than anything else tries to influence the complex interaction of technology and humanity in the interest of a society which complies fully with the requirements of universal human rights. We have the freedom, the right and the responsibility to make use of our own thought power. We are the authors of our own lives. Personal autonomy and freedom to make decisions are the prerequisites for an open democratic society." End quote. As this short summary of the core motifs of digital humanism shows, the idea of an ethical regulation of AI, which this project advocates, is in substantial regards informed by Kantian thoughts. In the context in which these leading ideas are expressed in the Vienna Manifesto, they are not philosophically analyzed, however, but just casually mentioned. In order to gain their full argumentative strength, the Kantian motifs of a digital humanism will have to be elucidated in a more careful way. Before we proceed in part 4 of this presentation to this philosophical analysis, a short preliminary remark on AI and ethics. As I have pointed out in a paper in 2020, two modes of ethical discourse are required for the regulation and control of AI. First, a discourse about the internal rules that guide algorithm-directed operations, and secondly, extensive reflections on the external, juridical and socio-political criteria governing the public regulations of AI. An in-depth debate, that is, on the ethical principles of human action, in which Kant's complex conception of ethics can play a substantial role. In regard to the first discourse, it is obvious that in serious attempts to close examine the inbuilt rules that direct bots, analytic shortcuts will not at all do their job. Computer programs that merely calculate a trans-individualistic general use and thus operate along the lines of a utilitarian consequentialism are quite obviously incompatible with the basic right of every human individual to live, a right which is encoded in the constitution of all modern states. Niederrümelin and Weidenfeld express this Kant-inspired maxim in Digitaler Humanismus correctly as follows, I quote, "The violation of basic rights cannot be offset by the advantages gained by third parties, however great they may be. No human being ought to be treated merely as a means. Humans do not optimize. In emergency situations, we act in accordance with moral intuition and not an optimizing calculation." End quote. What secondly is called for is an explicit discourse about the external, juridical and socio-political criteria governing the public and private use of AI. A philosophical in-depth debate, that is, on the ethical principles of human action, on principles that, to speak with Kant, cannot be fully simulated by heteronomous mechanical executions of programmed norms, even if these norms, as an advanced AI, are able to probabilistically readapt. Part 4 of my presentation. Some suggestions how the leading ethical ideas of digital humanism can be further solidified in explicit recourses to Kant. Kant's complex theory of moral judgment can be of great help in the search for generally acceptable criteria for the human control and evaluation of AI-steered programs. Digital humanism is influenced in substantial regards by popularized versions of Kant's discourse on ethics. The ethical concepts used by the authors of the Vienna Manifesto remain, however, rather vague. Part of the reason for this may be that Niederrümelin, who coined the term digital humanism, advocates an in some regards Kant-informed but ultimately non-Kantian concept of ethics. Critical reflections on Niederrümelin's Kant critique. Niederrümelin's analysis of practical reason are focused on what he calls structural rationality. They most obviously are influenced by Kant, but they ultimately terminate in a critique of what he claims to be Kant's deontological rationalism. In his analysis of the structures of agency, in Structural Rationality and Other Essays on Practical Reason, Niederrümelin first points out, along the lines of Kant, that human action is characterized by the ability of the agent to autonomous self-determination. By a mode of action it is where the action is not chosen because it corresponds to a present desire of the person. It is this feature of human action, Niederrümelin writes, which one might find most closely related to the Kantian conception. The reasonable choice of actions is autonomous and not heteronomous, that is, not determined by by momentary inclinations. After this pro-Kantian statement, Nieder-Rümelin distinguishes his conception of structural rationality, however, due to a predominantly formalistic interpretation of Kant's ethics that brackets Kant's complex conception of moral judgment from what he sees as Kant's flawed foundations of ethics. This similarity with Kant, Nieder-Rümelin writes, should not lead to normative a priorism. Kant, in Nieder-Rümelin's reading, falsely advocates, via his formalistically dimensioned categorical imperative, a situation insensitive a priorism in which the actual concreteness of moral deliberation and of moral judgment is nowhere validly reconstructed. Thus Nieder-Rümelin concludes, I quote, "The practical philosophy of Kant and of many of his successors is connected to an untenable form of rationalism," end quote. As I will try to show in the following, this critique rests, however, on a misreading of the process of moral deliberation and decision, which, according to Kant's own theory, follows never merely the abstract idea of the formal subsumption of a case under a rule. Nieder-Rümelin, while sympathizing with elements of Kant's ethics, does not keep in sight that Kant's analysis of autonomous actions has two constitutive elements. It firstly, and formally described, rests on the idea that since every human being has the ability to act in a self-determined manner, every human subject is an end in itself. This formal principle marks the essential difference between human persons and other entities that are not able to act from practical reason, like for instance in the context of our reflections, algorithm-directed bots. This formal principle must, however, secondly, as Kant is well aware, be situationally specified in any of its concrete implementations. In our practical knowledge as a whole, Kant writes in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, the pure part of ethics, quote, requires in addition a power of judgment, sharpened by experience, partly in order to distinguish the cases in which the laws of pure reason apply, partly to procure for them admittance to the will of man and influence over practice, end quote, Kant. These two processes, which are left unanalyzed in Nieder-Rümelin's Kant reading and critique, were carefully analyzed, however, by the American Kant scholars Barbara Herman and Alan Wood. The practice of moral judgment. In her book, The Practice of Moral Judgment, Barbara Herman shows that many of the standard readings of what analytic philosophers call Kant's CI procedure evade a full analysis of its complexity by wrongly approximating it to a subsumption procedure in which a general rule is applied to a particular case. In chapter 7 of her book, headed Moral Deliberation and the Derivation of Duties, she writes, I quote, "Interpreters and critics of Kant's ethics are heavily invested in the categorical imperative. There is an endless discussion about how or whether the CI works. A question that is much less frequently asked is, what role does the CI have in moral judgment? That is supposed to be obvious," end quote. Herman doubts this very much, however, and thus concludes, I quote, "I'm increasingly sure it is not." She calls into question the received view, expressed in standard analytic and rational choice theories, that Kant's CI procedure provides a kind of algorithm for moral deliberation. Criticizing this as a rationalistic misunderstanding, Barbara Herman sketches an alternative role for the CI within a more complex Kantian theory of moral judgment. Herman points out that in Kant's conception of practical reason, every concrete moral deliberation includes the agent's hermeneutical sensitivity for the context in which her or his intended action is embedded. A human potential, that is, which, as was argued in part 2 of my paper in recourse to Dreyfus and Kant, no computer is able to fully simulate. Moral action depends on the agent's capacity to assess the situation in which his action is performed. If this hermeneutical element of Kant's analysis of praxis is overlooked, his ethics can be easily misunderstood as nothing but an abstract formal procedure. Barbara Herman explicitly emphasizes with Kant that there are, quote, background conditions of moral judgment that must be present for deliberation to be possible. She rightly points out that Kant's ethics is not a theory which calls for a mechanical application of general moral rules. Such rules, as Herman writes, are abstract, impartial and impersonal. They do not provide a normal standard of action and deliberation in Kantian ethics. The categorical imperative is a higher order deliberative principle, not an abstract and general rule. Instead of including very general descriptions of action under which the particular is to be subsumed, it provides a procedure for structuring the particular in a moral way. End quote, Hermann. If the CI procedure is fully analyzed, it includes thus substantial elements of a hermeneutical assessment of the present situation. I quote, since the CI is used to assess maxims, and maxims are the subjective principles on which the agent in fact acts, Hermann points out when an agent constructs his maxim, he is to include in it just that detail of person and circumstance necessary to describe his action. End quote. Moral action is thus not a subsumption that can be mechanically carried out. As was already mentioned before, Kant himself, in the preface to his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, thematizes this complex structure when he writes, after first pointing out that in analysis of moral action the ground of obligation must be looked for not in the nature of man, not in the circumstances of the world in which he is placed, but solely a priori in the concepts of reason, that these laws, Kant continues, require in addition a power of judgment sharpened by experience in order to distinguish the cases to which they apply. End quote, Kant. This important aspect of Kant's ethics is overlooked in most standard analytic readings of the CI procedure, as well as in Niederrümelin's Kant critique. Properly read, Kant's exploration of the complexity of human deliberation can thus indeed prove very helpful for a digital humanism, which insists on the difference between full human action and its partial digital simulation. AI algorithms are, in at least two substantial regards, unable to autonomously perform intelligent moral action. They are firstly unable to fully assess the complex social texture of the situation in which they automatically, but nowhere in a genuine sense, autonomously apply their programs. And they are unable to freely find out or to acknowledge the bindingness of the laws they follow, since they are heteronomous recipients of orders, that is, of rules, that they execute. This substantial second difference between algorithmic instrumental rationality and human practical reason is interestingly explored in Alan Wood's analysis of Kant's thesis that the moral subject is Selbstzweck, end in itself. Alan Wood on humanity as end in itself. In his elaborate analysis of Kant's second formulation of the moral law and groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, act so that you use humanity in your own person as well as in that of another, always also as an end and never only as a means, the American Kant scholar Alan Wood rightly insists that the idea of human dignity, which grounds this formula, is the Kantian principle which arguably has the greatest resonance with our culture's moral consciousness. It is the obvious point of reference for the attempt to fully reconstruct in philosophical terms the core of autonomous human action. Alan points out that the formula of humanity as an end in itself has philosophers much to teach about Kantian ethical theory itself, since it presents ethics, in contrast to common misunderstanding of that theory, as based on an end, however, whose character clearly distinguishes Kant's theory from all forms of consequentialism, and thereby, we might add, from the instrumentalist ratio of purposive means-end relations that characterize algorithmic programs. What exactly, however, does it mean that human beings are ends in themselves? Wood elucidates the special quality of this end by discussing various conceptions of value that Kant introduces, and he thereby criticizes the standard analytic characterization of Kant's ethics. I quote, "To those who think of Kant's ethical theory as deontological in the sense that it is a theory which regards moral principles independent of any end served in following them," Wood writes, "it should be enlightening to find Kant explicitly rejecting any such position, and to realize that it is this rejection which lies behind the groundwork's argument that a rational will can be motivated to obey the categorical imperative only by a distinctive kind of end." And Wood points out that Kant distinguishes humanity as an end in itself from three other notions of end. He firstly contrasts it to a relative end, which could only grant hypothetical imperatives. He secondly opposes it as a self-sufficient end to an end to be effected. An example for such a non-self-sufficient end would be that when we build a house, our action is for the sake of bringing the house into being, and the house's value to us is the reason why we build it. And Kant thirdly distinguishes the end in itself from an end with only relative worth or price, whose value can be measured against the value of something else and can be rationally sacrificed to obtain something else of equivalent or greater worth. In contrast to these three limited notions of an end, humanity as an end in itself is an end with absolute worth, as Kant also says, with dignity, something whose value cannot be compared to, traded off against, or compensated for, or replaced by any other value. What Kant refers to when he says humanity is an end in itself, Wood concludes, is the capacity of human beings to set ends, and realization neither Römelin and Weidenfeld argue in their study. Choose means to them. This capacity obviously includes, however, as a mere substructure, the technical predisposition, which includes all our learned skills and deliberative abilities used for arbitrary ends. This substructure is nowhere self-sufficient, however. It is based on the capacity of any human person to be self-legislative. No AI structure, no person simulating bot has in any real sense this ability, we might conclude. Part 5, Coda. The need for a Kant as well as Horkheimer and Adorno-inspired critical theory of artificial intelligence. Becker-Seibert on the misreading of autonomy in a digital age. Self-legislation, autonomy, is thus the core of Kant's hermeneutic sensitive moral reason. Rightly understood and fully spelled out, Kant's conception of practical reason is able to provide the philosophical basis for digital humanism, which rejects the post-humanistic fantasy that AI singularity is the desirable direction in which the digitalization process should develop. The idea of an ethics-based, socio-political control of AI, the critical project of a digital humanism, is today, many claim, endangered, however, by digitally promoted and enforced simulacra of autonomy. In a recent essay headed The Self-Endangerment of Autonomy, Carlos Becker and Sandra Seubert pointed out that worldwide contemporary social-political situations are complicated by the fact that in our digital age, even the possible loci of responsible reflections, autonomy, individuality, and authenticity are targeted and subverted by a culture industry that via digital influencers and AI-supported political actors mass distributes simulacra of authentic individualized freedom and promotes narcissism-enhancing substitutes for autonomy which destroy what they pretend to offer, critical reflection and self-determination. Thus today, Becker and Seubert write a much-neglected early classic of critical theory, Horkheimer's and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment, gains unexpected actuality. The sharp-sighted reflections on the economy-driven production of quasi-subjective needs in the chapter The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception in Horkheimer Adorno's book is able to significantly contribute to an analysis of the social pathologies that accompany today's ever-increasing commodification and reification of privacy. The importance of these analyses of today's digitally produced modes of quasi-authenticity was recently emphasized also by the media scientist Andreas Sudman, one of the editors of the new transcript book series on AI, who points out that critique since Kant has meant questioning phenomena with regard to their functioning. Today, any in-depth analysis of the socio-political influence of AI has not only to assess the merits of an artificial intelligence, but also to include a careful analysis of the production of illusion and false consciousness by digitized communication, an analysis to which, as Suderman points out, Adorno and Horkheimer in pre-digital times felt deeply committed in their critical analysis of the Dialectic of Enlightenment. A digital humanism that explores the merits and limits of AI thus has to integrate impulses from Horkheimer's and Adorno's critical theory into its philosophical defense of the core role that practical reason in Kant's sense continues to play in our digital age. Thank you for your attention.